This is the Middle-earth philosopher. When it comes to the Beleriand Wars of the First Age, the Sindar, though initially active in the first conflicts, largely become relegated to the sidelines as it were, and are pretty much almost forgotten about, arguably, leaving the bulk of the fighting and the siege to the Noldor and their human allies. And this is largely due to the many political and personal divisions and prejudices that existed between High King Thingol and some of the princes of the Noldor that lived to the east of Doriath. However, what is often overlooked is that not all the Sindar followed after their king's grudges, and also aided in the war effort in what ways that they could actively. I'm primarily talking about the Falas, the Elves of the Falas, led by Círdan. And because they're so often overlooked, I wanted to look at what motivated and drove these elves to be the ride or die for the Noldor cause. The Falas were, while still technically Teleri and answerable to Thingol, also operated as their own kingdom. Círdan, their lord, was among the first generation of elves that awoke in the First Age, and thus held near equal authority and was also very respected among his people. Unlike Thingol and many of the Sindarin, however, Círdan doesn't appear to hold a grudge against the Noldor, even after learning about the Alqualande incident. Nor does he seem as hostile or as egotistical as the High King or the Sons of Fëanor, whom were in something of a cold war with Thingol to say the least. One could argue that this is largely because of the aid that his people received during the First War with the Orcs, where the Falas was under siege and was only lifted when the Noldor arrived. Whatever the circumstance, Círdan's modesty helped him to have strong ties with all of the Elves of Beleriand, but especially Finrod Felagund, which may not seem surprising since Finrod was pretty much the Noldor's ambassador when dealing with other peoples. More so that Círdan had attended the gathering of many elf lords after the First Wars that was made up of Noldor and Sindar elves, and had sworn allegiance just as many of them did. So you can also argue that Círdan was just basically more honorable than a lot of the other Sindar were. Or perhaps it could be a situation that Círdan saw that the Noldor and the Sindar had much bigger problems to the north in the guise of Morgoth to worry about personal grudges and mistakes made in the past. But you may ask, so what? What's the big deal? One bunch of elves decided to help out the other. And I'm about to point out why this was so important. Basically, that one, Círdan was well aware that the Noldor were much better physically suited to head-on warfare and confrontations with the orc armies. The Falas were even weaker than Doriath's armies, whom, thanks to their imported dwarf weapons, had been the only successful native force to repel the enemy during the First War before the Noldor arrived. And yet, despite this disparity, they still contributed to the cause with what they had, their ships. Essentially, and if you can picture this, the Falas pretty much acted like elf Vikings, raiding up along the coast and outflanking orc armies when they're engaged with the Noldor, because they are Teleri and shipbuilding and sealing was their thing. And this helped out the Noldor in more than one occasion, from rescuing besieged Noldor forces to building ships to sail to the west to seek out aid, even though Noldor were not supposed to be able to do that, and most of the time no one ever returned from those voyages. But the Falas still helped out anyway. And it's not like this was a one-sided affair, in that the Noldor, or at least the western Noldor, aided the Falas as well by reinforcing their city walls to withstand orc attacks, as well as sending their own children there to be safe from the front lines when the fighting with the north got really bad. So, the question, why were the Falas and Círdan so damn loyal to the Noldor and the Noldor cause, especially given that Doriath and many other Sindar could give less of a fuck? And I think it comes down to one or a mix of three things. A sense of priority, and that fighting Morgoth and elf camaraderie was more important to pretty Skobbles, or that the Noldor of Western Beleriand at least were not the same as our hot-headed kindred in the east, and thus did not deserve the same contempt and stubbornness that their own king was showing, or that they may have been just pissed about the Noldor's past actions and many of their people's arrogance as well, yet were wise enough to keep it to themselves and keep their eyes on the larger issue of Morgoth to the north. The Falas may have been the weaker of the Beleriand alliance, but they were by far, I believe, the most noble and faithful, not letting any entitlement or ego cloud what they saw as the bigger problem that they faced, something that many of their allies seem to have lost sight of. And that is why, to me anyway, that the fall of the Falas after the Battle of Numbered Tears is so tragic. Of all the elves in Beleriand, they most of all did not deserve to get caught up in the ruin of their country. And it's also no wonder why Círdan proved to be arguably the wisest elf east of the sea for all 3 ages of Middle-earth.